The history of Royal Arch Freemasonry in Illinois. The first known Royal Arch Freemason to set foot on what would become the soil of Illinois was Captain Meriwether Lewis of the famed Lewis and Clark expedition that explored the Northwest. Lewis was initiated at In the Door to Virtue Lodge number 44, AF&AM in Albemarle County, Virginia. On the 20th of January 1797, he was elected to membership, initiated, and given his apron. The following evening, he was passed to the degree of Fellowcraft, and then he was promoted at sight to the degree of Master Mason. He was 23 years old at this time. The Masonic apron, which I will now show, was found in the pocket of Lewis's coat when he passed away. It is currently in the possession of the Grand Lodge of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons of Montana, located in Helena, Montana. Lewis received his past Master Mason degree on April 2nd or 3rd, 1797 in the same lodge. He received this degree along with Peter and Samuel Carr, who were nephews of Thomas Jefferson and whose son-in-law, Governor Randolph, was also in attendance. Lewis was exalted to the sublime degree of Royal Arch Super Excellent Mason in a Royal Arch chapter operating out of Staunton Lodge number 13 in Staunton, Virginia on the 31st of October, 1797. A copy of his certificate, which has the seal, is on the next page. The first attempt to start a chapter in Illinois can be traced to a Henry Griswold, who was exalted at Jerusalem chapter number 2 in Vergennes, Vermont on the 27th of May, 1820. He moved to Illinois later in 1820 and had a farm near Whitehall, Illinois. There's communication dated on the 27th of September, 1826, which was sent to him, which was a summons that states that there would be a meeting of companions of the Royal Arch Masons at the town of Jacksonville, Illinois, on the first day of the Circuit Court, which had the objective to petition the General Grand Chapter of the Royal Arch for dispensation to open a new Royal Arch chapter in Jacksonville. However, there's no record of that chapter being formed. The next attempt to form a chapter took place in 1840 in Vandalia, which had been the state capital for 20 years prior to that date, but it had just seen the capital move to Springfield, where it still remains. The chapter would have been Vandalia chapter number 160, and we know this because there's a record in the Grand Chapter of Pennsylvania which states that the petition was received and recommended by Missouri chapter number 1 in St. Louis, and Illinois did not have a Grand Chapter this time. They were given approval by the Grand Chapter, however, there's no record of them meeting. The last reference found for this chapter was in January 1848, which was a reference in the communication of Peoria chapter number 7, which resolved that Companion McNeil confer with the Companions of Vandalia chapter regarding the purchase of their regalia. On April 6, 1818, Edmund Roberts visited Western Star Lodge number 107 in Kaskaskia and registered as a Mark Master. Roberts was a merchant in St. Genevieve, Louisiana Territory, which is now the state of Missouri. He relocated to Kaskaskia and was elected master of the same lodge above on the 27th of December, 1819. In 1832, he moved to Springfield, and on May 31st, 1841, signed the petition for the dispensation for Springfield chapter number 1 to the Grand Royal Arch chapter, and he was also elected king of Springfield chapter number 1. Springfield chapter number 1 was further helped along by Missouri chapter number 1, who on June 12, 1841, read the petition and stated that they were worthy of their privilege and that they would recommend to the General Grand Royal Arch chapter in the United States to grant them the privilege of their petition. Their first convocation was held on the 13th of August, 1841. 6 of the petition signers and 3 visitors constituted the attendance of the convocation. The chapter was open in due form, the visitors were admitted into membership at the chapter, and the committee was appointed to draft bylaws. Unfortunately, these bylaws were omitted from the General Grand chapter proceedings of this year, so there's no copy of them known to be in existence. We do know that 7 petitions were received and all were elected to receive their degrees. The candidates immediately had their degrees conferred upon them after a resolution to dispense with the second section of the 9th article of the chapter's bylaws, which stated that petitions needed to lie over to the next regular meeting. This was done because many of the members in attendance this night lived in the country some distance of 12 to 15 miles from the city of Springfield. The returns of the Grand Royal Arch chapter showed 17 companions in total for Springfield number 1, with a receipt of $90 for dispensation, which is adjusted to $3,190.52 in today's currency, and $12 for dues, which is $425.40 in today's currency. Their charter was granted by the Grand Royal Arch chapter on September 17, 1841. Unfortunately, all records for Springfield number 1 were burned in 1850, except for the petition for degrees for U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, which was saved by the secretary of that chapter due to Douglas's popularity at that time and kept by him at his home. This petition has been preserved since and is still a treasured possession of this chapter. The first chapter in Chicago was Lafayette number 18, which was chartered on September 10, 1844. A petition for dispensation was drawn up on the festival of St. John the Baptist on June 24, 1844. It was signed by 11 companions and was recommended by Milwaukee chapter number 1 on July 1, 1844. Dispensation was granted dated July 2, 1844, and their first convocation was held on July 30, 1844. In total, 10 convocations were held under their dispensation, 6 petitions were received, and 5 candidates were exalted. Fees for the degrees at the time were Mark Master $5, which is $205.61 today, Past Master $2, which is $82.24 today, Most Excellent Master $5, $205.61 today, and Holy Royal Arch Mason $10, which is $411.22 today. Dues were 25 cents, which is $10.28 today, quarterly in advance, and no companion could vote or hold office whose dues were not paid. Ministers were admitted without a fee to this chapter. The dispensation, bylaws, and a copy of the minutes are in the archives of the General Grand chapter. The next chapter to ask for dispensation from the General Grand Royal Arch chapter was Jacksonville number 3. This was granted on July 25, 1845. Their first convocation was held on September 15, 1845. When their dispensation was read, the chapter was opened in due form, and constitution bylaws were adopted. 3 petitions for degrees were received, and all of these were elected and received their degrees the same day. Horeb chapter number 4 has few details surrounding it previous to 1850. There is a mention in the proceedings of the General Grand chapter stating that dispensation was granted on March 10, 1846 for the chapter, and a charter was issued on September 17, 1847. We can piece together that the chapter held its convocations in both Henderson and Knoxville, Illinois, and they went back and forth until 1859 when the meetings in Knoxville were discontinued. On January 7, 1873, the chapter transferred to the town of Rio. Quincy chapter number 5 had its dispensation issued on April 1, 1846 by the General Grand Royal Arch chapter, and their first convocation was held on April 25, 1846, at which time the bylaws were adopted, 8 petitions were received. This dispensation also allowed for the authority for this chapter to confer the cryptic degrees. However, there's no records to show that if they ever conferred these degrees or not. At this time, there was apparently some question regarding the conferring of the past master degree. The chapter resolved that no business could be done except when the Royal Arch chapter was open, and that a brother past master who has not received the degree of Mark Master should not be allowed to sit in a lodge of past masters. Quincy chapter number 5 exalted Stephen A. Douglas along with A.S. Pettit on September 3rd, 1847. You'll remember that Douglas petitioned Springfield chapter number 1 for their degrees. So it's unclear if this was courtesy work done for Springfield chapter number 1 or if Douglas withdrew his petition at Springfield number 1 and petitioned this chapter. The chapter was constituted on December 27, 1847. Of interest is that there are 5 entries in their minutes from 1852 to 1856 mentioning loans given to members based upon their pledge of their marks, which is a central theme of the Mark Master degree. It appears that the amount seems to be around $60 for these loans, which in 1852 was $2,403.25 today, and in 1859, $2,229.52 in today's currency. Shawnee chapter number 6 is first referenced in the records of Louisville chapter number 5, also known as King Solomon chapter number 5, Kentucky. The minutes on March 30th, 1846 read that the companions of Shawneetown had petitioned the General Grand Chapter for dispensation, and that the companions asked for a recommendation from that chapter, which was granted. Dispensation was granted by the General Grand Chapter on June 3rd, 1846, and the first convocation of the chapter was held on June 22nd, 1846. 25 meetings were held under dispensation from June 22nd, 1846 to July 10th, 1847. The charter was granted on September 15th, 1847 and received by the chapter on October 11th, 1847. The chapter was constituted on May 19th, 1848 and on June 11th, on June 1st, 1848. The degree of Mark Master was conferred on a brother Winston, who was Master-elect of Caseyville Lodge, Kentucky. From the date of the charter to the transfer of it under the Grand Chapter of Illinois on October 14, 1850, 47 convocations were held. The charter was arrested in 1867 due to only 7 convocations being held after that date in 1850. The Egyptian chapter under dispensation was recommended in Jonesboro on May 26, 1858. However, once dispensation was granted, there was little activity at the chapter. Only 3 petitions were received on May 26, 1868. They were notified that they were delinquent 7 years' dues, and unless payment was made, they would be removed. It appears that this action was taken. Peoria chapter number 7 filed a petition with the General Grand Chapter, and it appears that instead of dispensation being granted, that they had a chapter granted on September 17, 1847. Their first meeting was then held on January 4th, 1848, at which time they invited Levi Lusk from Rushville to install officers, and Z.P. Cabinus of Springfield number 1 was invited to give instruction. On January 7th, 1848, their bylaws were adopted. On January 20th, 1845, Companion Lusk installed their officers, and on February 12th, 1845, 3 candidates were exalted, one of whom was William C. Hobbs, who was elected Grand Master in the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Illinois Ancient Free and Accepted Masons the following year. Their high priest, Peter Sweat, was appointed to represent the chapter, the organization of the Grand Chapter of Illinois on April 9, 1850 in Springfield. For some reason, the chapter failed to hold a convocation for several months in 1850. However, when a past Grand High Priest of the Grand Chapter of Missouri visited on September 16, 1850, it reinvigorated the chapter, and they grew to be the 2nd largest in Illinois. Several other chapters were issued dispensation from the General Grand Chapter between 1848 and 1850. Howard Chapter on July 28, 1848. Stapleton Chapter in Rushville on June 28, 1849. Barrett Chapter, Rock Island on August 1, 1849. Anne Reynolds chapter in Cambridge, Illinois on March 2nd, 1850. During the Grand Lodge sessions in Alton, Illinois from October 2nd to 5th in 1848, there was an attempt made to organize a grand chapter for the state of Illinois. Only 3 chapters took place in this meeting: Jacksonville number 3, Horup chapter number 4, and Howard chapter number 8. Other chapters at this time were protesting the matter due to not being notified, even though there was sentiment for the organization of a grand chapter. On April 24, 1847, Quincy chapter number 5 had appointed a committee to correspond with other chapters regarding the subject of forming a grand chapter. The high priest of Quincy number 5 was instructed on April 25, 1849, to use his influence at the upcoming Grand Lodge session to complete this objective. The companion who was elected Grand High Priest at the meeting in 1848 took steps to call another meeting, sending letters to each chapter in the state. Soon after the Grand Lodge sessions of 1849, the officer of Grand Secretary was burned and all the proceedings from the Grand Lodge sessions were destroyed. To remedy this loss, the Grand Master called a special communication of the Grand Lodge to be held on April 10, 1850. During that session, 15 delegates from all the chapters except for Shawneetown met and organized the Grand Chapter. The below were elected Grand Officers: Grand High Priest William B. Warren of Jacksonville, Deputy Grand High Priest John H. Holton of Quincy, Grand King J. V. Z. Blamey, Chicago, Grand Scribe Peter Sweat of Peoria, Grand Secretary Mason Brayman of Springfield, Grand Treasurer Thomas H. Campbell of Springfield, and Grand Marshal W. S. Hurst of Jacksonville. These officers were installed by Z.P. Cabinets of Springfield number 1, who was a past high priest of that chapter. During that session, the Grand High Priest was authorized to draw funds to pay for his expenses to attend the General Grand Chapter Convocation, which was held in Boston on September 10, 1850. However, he was unable to make the trip, and the Grand Chapter was represented by N. Coffey as his proxy, along with the Grand King J. V. Z. Blamey from Chicago. The bylaws of the Grand Chapter of Ohio were adopted to be those of Illinois, with some changes made in a few sections. At the first Grand Convocation in Alton on October 14, 1850, dispensations for Maridosia Chapter number 11 and Union Chapter at Griggsville were reported as being issued by the Grand High Priest and Deputy Grand High Priest accordingly. In 1853, the High Priest of Lafayette Chapter number 2 refused to admit a visitor from Pennsylvania because the work in Pennsylvania was essentially different from the work of the Grand Chapter. This caused an uproar in other jurisdictions, and in 1857 there was a resolution passed to admit visitors from the state of Pennsylvania. In 1853, the Illinois State Legislature enacted the act to incorporate the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of the state of Illinois and the subordinate chapters under its jurisdiction. Due to the distance from towns in southern Illinois to towns in which other chapters were located, permission was granted to permit St. Louis Chapter number 8 to confer degrees upon Illinois candidates. As the state of Illinois became more settled, membership increased. In 1850, there was a total of 327 companions. This number grew to 1,629 in 1860. The outbreak of the Civil War caused a hardship for many chapters, as much of the companions left to serve in the Army and Navy at this time. In 1862, 8 Grand Chapter officers were absent at the convocation, and it was necessary to withhold all of the per diem and half the mileage, as well as borrow $500, which is $15,268.17 in today's currency, to pay for the running expenses of the Grand Chapter. At the close of the Civil War to 1868, membership of chapters in Illinois boomed, and 52 new chapters were chartered, and membership numbers increased to 8,299 companions in 1870. On July 1st, 1863, a dispensation was issued for a military traveling chapter, Asboth Military Chapter under dispensation, which was named for Brigadier General Alexander Asboth. It was officered by civilians attached to the military in Columbus, Kentucky. It met from July 6, 1863 to January 20th, 1864, when it was then moved to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and met there from January 28th, 1864 to February 24th, 1864. It went defunct on February 25th, 1864. The Grand High Priest, Hiram W. Hubbard, who was a renowned ritualist who served as high priest no less than 4 chapters, went with the chapter to Vicksburg, where he observed upon arrival. We found the Masonic Temple under control of the military authorities. The lodge room was occupied by 3 military lodges, the chapter room by the military commission, who cheerfully gave way. We found several Royal Arch Masons there from Illinois and a number of the former officers and members of Vicksburg Chapter No. 3, who rendered in every assistance in their power by furnishing robes, jewels, and fixtures and aiding in the work. When Asboth left for Vicksburg, a dispensation was issued for a Hurlburt military chapter under dispensation, named for General Stephen Augustus Hurlbut, but he was commander of the Army of the Gulf during the Civil War. Unfortunately, the chapter held only 6 convocations and conferred degrees on 4 candidates, with none of those candidates being exalted to the degree of Holy Royal Arch Mason. Asboth's chapter's register was discovered in the Grand Secretary's archives in 2013. It weighed about 2 pounds 11 ounces, and it was 10 inches by 15 inches, and one thick 1 inch, bound in brown leather cowhide with decorative patches, saddle stitched with marbled end papers. On the front cover is a large paper labeled which reads Asboth Military Chapter Dispensation Surrendered, perhaps affixed by then Grand Secretary Harmon G. Reynolds. Among the 100 pages are detailed accounts, all neatly penned and most likely of quill ink, of business conducted and the degrees conferred at the meetings held in 1863 and 1864. If original, it would have been impossible for the ledger to have been used simultaneously by Asboth and Vicksburg, which was 366 miles south along the Mississippi River from Hurlburt in Columbus during overlapping periods. Thus, the records of Hurlburt's meetings were appended to be those of Asboth's entries at some point from another set. That concludes the history of the Grand Royal Arch in Illinois. Thank you for listening.